The dog had already been sedated once. That was the part nobody talked about when they brought Nurse Reeve Halston into the room. They handed her a clipboard with a euthanasia authorization form and told her it was a formality. The Belgian Malinois in the kennel behind the reinforced glass, lean, trembling, baring his teeth at the wall, had already bitten 2 handlers. He had destroyed 3 kennel doors in 4 days. The base veterinarian had signed off. The paperwork was sitting right there, waiting for her signature as the on-call medical officer. Reeve looked at the dog. The dog looked at her. She set the clipboard down on the counter without signing it. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. The corporal standing beside her, a young man named Duffy whose job it was to witness the signing, looked at her like she'd asked to borrow a helicopter. "Ma'am, that animal is flagged as a code red. You can't go in there." "I'm not going in," she said. "I just need 10 minutes on this side of the glass." Nobody stopped her, mostly because nobody knew what to say. Reeve Halston had a way of doing things that left people slightly off balance, like she'd already thought 3 moves ahead and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She was 31 years old, a registered nurse with a specialization in trauma and critical care, currently attached to CFB Petawawa on a rotation that was supposed to involve human patients. She had short, dark hair, perpetually ink-stained fingers from writing notes in the margins of whatever she was reading, and a reputation for being unusually calm in situations that made other people loud. She pulled a chair up to the glass and sat down. The dog, his name was Bowen, according to the kennel tag, a Belgian Malinois, who had served 4 deployments with Master Corporal Jules Ashford of the Canadian Special Operations Forces, stopped trembling. He didn't calm down. But he stopped trembling, which was different. Reeve watched him. She didn't tap the glass. She didn't make sounds. She didn't hold up her hands in that slow, non-threatening way she'd seen trainers do in videos. She just sat there, slightly angled away from him, and let him look at her on his own terms. After 6 minutes, Bowen lay down, not relaxed. His ears were still pinned back, his muscles still coiled. But he lay down, and he put his head on his paws, and he watched her with amber eyes that held something complicated in them, something that wasn't aggression. It was the kind of look that animals gave when they were waiting to see if you were going to leave, too. Reeve understood that look. She'd seen it in the ICU, in the faces of patients who'd coded and come back. That specific expression of someone who had already lost the most important thing and was bracing for the rest of it to follow. She stood up after 8 minutes and went to find the base commander. She hadn't planned any of this. That was important to understand, because the story would later be told in a way that made it sound like Reeve Halston showed up at CFB Petawawa knowing exactly what she was going to do. She didn't. She had shown up with a duffel bag, a thermos of dark coffee, and a stack of clinical notes she was supposed to file by the end of the week. The Belgian Malinois had been an accident of timing. She'd been walking past the veterinary facility when she heard the sound coming from inside. Not barking. Something lower than that. Something that pulled at the back of her sternum the way certain sounds did when they were carrying grief instead of anger. She had stopped walking. Then she had gone inside. That was all. The thing that nobody outside the military fully understood, and that Reeve herself only partially understood at the time, was what happened to a working dog when his handler died. The bond between a military working dog and his handler was not a professional relationship. It was not a working arrangement. It was the closest thing to absolute trust that either of them would ever experience, built not through affection, but through daily proximity, shared danger, and the accumulated weight of surviving things together. Bowen had gone out on patrol with Jules Ashford for 3 years. He had slept beside him in tents in temperatures that dropped below -30. He had tracked a man through a compound in the dark at a dead run, with Ashford's hand signal against his flank the only instruction he needed. When Ashford died, not in the field, not overseas, but in a parking garage in Ottawa, in a way that made no sense and that investigators were still trying to understand, Bowen had been brought back to Petawawa and placed in standard kennel care. Standard kennel care meant isolation, routine feeding, minimal handling. The assumption was that a working dog was a tool, and tools could be reassigned. Nobody had thought to account for grief. Reeve had seen it immediately through the glass. What they were calling aggression was something else. Bowen wasn't dangerous in the way the paperwork suggested. He was inconsolable. He was waiting for someone to come back who wasn't coming, and every person who approached the kennel door was being measured against that absence and found wrong. She explained this to Lieutenant Colonel Fraser in as few words as possible. Fraser was a compact man in his late 50s with a particular economy of movement that came from decades of military habit. He listened to Reeve with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable, and when she finished, he said, "Halston, you are a trauma nurse." "Yes, sir. Not a veterinarian. Not a dog trainer. Not an animal behaviorist. Not anyone who has, as far as I'm aware, any formal training in military working dog protocols." "That's all correct," she said. "But I'd like to try something with your permission. Non-invasive. Low risk. If it doesn't work within 72 hours, I'll sign the paperwork myself." Fraser studied her for a long moment. He was the kind of man who had learned to recognize competence by the way a person stood when they made a request. Not arrogance, not desperation, but the quiet certainty of someone who had already done the calculation and knew what the answer was. He uncrossed his arms. 72 hours, he said. She moved a chair into the corridor outside Bowen's kennel and started spending time there. Not doing anything, not trying to interact with him, just being present in a way that was consistent. Same time each morning, same chair, same posture, same unhurried quality of attention. She brought her charts. She drank her coffee. She let him track her movements through the kennel gate, and she did not, under any circumstances, perform calm. She simply was calm because she had trained herself to be calm in rooms where people were dying, and this was not so different. On the second day, she started talking. Not to Bowen, exactly, or not only to Bowen. She talked the way she sometimes talked to unconscious patients in the ICU, not expecting a response, just filling the silence with something human. She talked about the drive up from Ottawa, about the road through Renfrew County when the maples were starting to turn, about a terrible sandwich she'd had at a gas station in Arnprior. Small things, texture of life. The kind of ordinary detail that wasn't meant to communicate anything except, "I am here, and I am not a threat, and I am not going anywhere." On the afternoon of the second day, Bowen walked to the gate. He didn't press against it. He stood about 2 feet back and watched her with those amber eyes and breathed. She kept talking about something inconsequential. She thought it was about a book she was reading, some long historical novel she'd been working through for 3 months. She didn't reach toward him. She didn't adjust her position. After a while, he lay down with his nose about 8 inches from the gate. She looked at him over the top of her notes and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a clean clinical word for. On the morning of the third day, she let herself into the kennel. Corporal Duffy, who had drawn the short straw and been assigned to monitor her experiment, went pale. "Halston, ma'am, you can't." "I've cleared it with the CO," she said, which was true. Fraser had approved it with the caveat that she was an idiot and that he would be very disappointed if she got bitten. She went in slowly. She didn't face Bowen directly. She sat down on the floor along the near wall, cross-legged, angled maybe 45 degrees away from him, and she went back to her notes. He didn't move for 11 minutes. Then he walked over and smelled her hair. She kept writing. He lay down beside her, not touching, but beside her, and put his head on the floor and exhaled a long, slow breath that sounded like something releasing. Corporal Duffy, watching through the window, later said he'd had something in his eye. The paperwork authorizing Bowen's euthanasia was quietly moved to a pending file, and then, after 2 weeks, removed from the active queue altogether. Reeve kept her regular nursing duties and added a daily session with Bowen. And somewhere in the second week, it stopped feeling like an experiment and started feeling like part of the rhythm of the day. It was during that second week that she started asking questions about Ashford. She told herself it was clinical. She was trying to understand Bowen's specific history, the commands he knew, the routines he'd been trained in, so that she could better help him adjust. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The more she learned about how Jules Ashford died, the less the story made sense, and the thing inside her that noticed when things didn't make sense was the same thing that had made her a good trauma nurse. Ashford had been found in the parking garage of a government building in downtown Ottawa on a Tuesday evening in September. He had been on leave. He was not supposed to be in Ottawa. The official report listed the cause of death as a fall from the second level, an accident, pending investigation. But the detail that nobody could account for was the keycard access log. Ashford's security card had been used to enter a restricted access point in the building 40 minutes before his body was found. A floor he had no authorization to be on. Reeve found this in a document she wasn't technically supposed to be reading, shared by a CFNIS investigator named Corporal Tien, who had come to Petawawa to collect some of Ashford's service records and had been careless about leaving his tablet unattended in the break room. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she went and found Corporal Tien before he left the base. "I'm not investigating anything," she said, which was the kind of sentence people said when they absolutely were investigating something. "But the dog. Bowen. He did something this morning I can't explain, and I think it might be relevant to your file." Tien looked at her with the weary skepticism of someone who had heard a lot of things from a lot of people who were not investigators. "What did the dog do?" "He alerted," she said. She explained it carefully. That morning she had brought in a box of Ashford's personal effects that had been cleared for disposal. Just things from his locker, a water bottle, a folded jacket, a paperback with a broken spine. Standard procedure when a handler died. She had set the box down in the kennel without thinking about it, and Bowen had moved directly to one corner of the jacket, sniffed it twice, and then sat. Not lay down. Sat, the formal, deliberate position of a dog indicating a find. Tien was quiet for a moment. "What was in the corner of the jacket?" he asked. "That's what I'm trying to tell you," she said. There was a flash drive sewn into the inside lining of the jacket. Tiny, professional. The kind of a modification you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it, or unless a dog with 4 years of trained detection work pressed his nose against it and told you it was there. Reeve didn't know what was on it. She handed it directly to Tien and then spent the next 6 hours in a state of controlled uncertainty that she managed by going and sitting with Bowen and pretending to read. What followed was not her story to tell, or at least not all of it. It moved quickly into jurisdictions and clearance levels she had no part of and was not briefed on. She knew that Tien made several phone calls. She knew that a second investigative team arrived at Petawawa within 48 hours. She knew that 2 weeks later there was a quiet article in the Ottawa Citizen about a civilian contractor who had resigned from a Department of National Defense project under unspecified circumstances, and she was reasonably sure that was connected, though nobody confirmed it to her directly. What she was told, officially, was very little. What she understood from the shape of what wasn't being said was that Jules Ashford had found something he shouldn't have found, had tried to protect the evidence, and had not survived long enough to get it where he needed it to go. Except that he had in his own way, because Bowen had been carrying it. Or rather, Bowen had known it was there. And Bowen had been waiting, in his grief-ridden way, for someone to sit still long enough to let him show them. She cried once about that, in her car, in the parking lot behind the medical building, on a Tuesday afternoon. Not for long. She was not generally a person who cried for long, but she cried because Jules Ashford had trusted his dog with the most important thing he had, and the dog had not let him down, and that deserved acknowledgement. Then, she went back inside and filed her charts. The question of what happened to Bowen was not settled quickly, and the process was not simple, and there were several weeks where it was genuinely unclear whether the military would retain him for reassignment, which Reeve felt, with a conviction she struggled to articulate professionally, would be the wrong decision, or release him through the adoption program. She submitted a formal request. Then she submitted a second one with additional documentation. Then she had a 20-minute conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Fraser that she later described to a colleague over coffee as one of the more interesting disagreements I've had with a superior officer. Fraser described it to the same colleague later that same day as Halston explaining to me why I was going to do what she wanted while technically asking a question. The adoption was approved in November. She drove to pick him up on a Saturday morning when there was frost on the road, and the sky over the Ottawa Valley was that particular shade of pale blue that felt like the whole world had been exhaled and held. Bowen was waiting in the kennel, already on his feet, because somehow he always seemed to know things slightly before they happened. She opened the gate. He walked out and sat beside her and looked at the sky. It was the first time she had seen him outside, in the open air, with no fence between him and the horizon. He held very still for a moment, ears forward, reading the wind with the focused intensity of an animal doing what it had been built to do. Then he looked up at her. She clipped his leash. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's go." The drive back was long. Bowen rode in the back seat with his head out the window for the first 40 minutes, and then he pulled himself in and lay down and slept with the boneless confidence of an animal that had decided, at last, that wherever it was going was somewhere it was safe to close its eyes. Reeve drove through the valley with the radio low and thought about Jules Ashford, whom she had never met. She thought about the kind of person who sewed a flash drive into a jacket lining and trusted his dog to find the right moment. She thought about the fact that trust like that had to be built over years, over cold mornings and long patrols, and every time the world went very loud and dangerous, and the only thing between you and the worst of it was the creature at your side. She thought about Bowen lying down on the third morning, that long, slow exhale, like something releasing. She did not know yet, not precisely, not in any way she had put into words, that this was going to become the work she spent the next decade of her life on. The application she would submit to the RCMP Working Dog Program and then to the Canadian Forces School of Military Working Dogs at CFB Borden. The evaluation framework she would help develop for dogs in what the handlers would start calling complex grief states. The protocol, eventually named after no one, which was how she wanted it, that would become a standard assessment tool for military working dogs at risk of premature retirement. She didn't know any of that yet on the drive back through the valley. She just drove, and Bowen slept, and the pale blue sky stayed pale blue all the way home. There is a particular kind of person who does the right thing not because they calculated that it was the right thing, but simply because they were in a room where the wrong thing was about to happen and they could not make themselves agree to it. Reeve Halston was that kind of person. She had been that kind of person in the ICU at 2 a.m, fighting for patients whose paperwork had already started the process of letting them go. She was that kind of person in a corridor, outside a reinforced kennel, holding a clipboard she refused to sign. She wasn't a hero in the way that word usually gets used. She didn't rush in. She sat down. She paid attention. She was patient in the specific way that patience becomes its own form of courage. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't look like much from the outside, that is mostly just a person deciding to stay in the room when the room is uncomfortable and the easy choice is to leave. Bowen had been waiting for that person. He had been waiting, in his inconsolable, faithful, animal way, for the one person who would sit still and let him tell them what he knew. She sat still, he told her. That winter, she framed a photograph that Corporal Tien had sent her. One of the few photos of Ashford and Bowen together, taken in the field somewhere, both of them looking at something outside the frame with the same focused attention, the same forward lean. She hung it in the hallway of her house in Pembroke, where she passed it every morning. She never talked about the case publicly. She didn't post about it online. She didn't give interviews. The only evidence that any of it had happened in the ordinary physical world was the dog who slept at the foot of her bed and lifted his head every time she came through the door, and the evaluation framework with her name quietly buried in the acknowledgments, and the 47 dogs she would go on to assess before the decade was out. Dogs who had been flagged for euthanasia and weren't because someone had learned to sit beside a gate in the early morning and pay attention. 47 dogs. Jules Ashford had trusted one. That one had been enough.